Mara Ellison had exactly 3 dresses. One she wore for work, one she wore for town, and one she kept folded at the bottom of a cedar chest that had belonged to her grandmother. She hadn't opened that chest in 2 years. There didn't seem to be a point. She was 26 years old, and she'd spent most of those years learning how to take up as little space as possible. It wasn't something she'd decided consciously. It happened the way most things happen to people who grow up being told they're wrong, gradually, then all at once. She learned to sit at the end of benches, to speak only when spoken to slip in and out of rooms without drawing attention. She'd become so skilled at disappearing that sometimes she startled people who hadn't noticed her standing 3 feet away. Black Hollow, Nevada, in the year 1882, was not a town built for women like Mara. It was built for speed and transaction, cattle drives, land deals, freight routes cutting east toward the railroad terminus. The men who came through were hard-faced and tired. The women who stayed were either wives or daughters, or both, and the ones who got chosen for the former were always the same kind. Young, narrow through the waist, pleasant to look at, quick with a smile. Everyone understood this. It was simply how things worked. Mara was none of those things. She knew it. She'd been told it often enough that the knowledge had settled somewhere behind her sternum, like a stone she carried everywhere. She worked at the dry goods store, owned by a man named Fletcher Dodd, who paid her 60 cents a week because she didn't complain and she didn't steal, and she could add numbers faster than anyone else he'd ever hired. She stacked crates and swept floors and cut fabric in even lengths, and never once asked for more money. She thought about asking. She'd been thinking about it for 3 years. The morning it all changed, she was sweeping the front step when she heard the bell. Not the church bell. Black Hollow's church had burned down 2 winters ago, and nobody had gotten around to rebuilding it. This was the assembly bell, the one bolted to the post outside the sheriff's office, the one that meant everyone was supposed to stop what they were doing and come to the square. Mara leaned her broom against the doorframe and looked down the street. People were already moving. Women wiping their hands on aprons, men stepping off porches. A group of children ran past her without looking up. She felt the first thread of unease. Sheriff Dale Connors was a man who believed in order, the way other men believed in whiskey, deeply, consistently, and with a certainty that occasionally made him dangerous. He'd been sheriff of Black Hollow for 11 years, which meant he'd outlasted 2 mayors, 1 cholera outbreak, and a range war that had burned 3 homesteads to ash. He was not a bad man, exactly. He was the kind of man who confused the rules he'd invented with the rules of nature itself. He stood on the steps of his office when Mara reached the square, his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching the crowd assemble with the expression of someone who had already decided how this would go. "I'll keep this short," he said, once enough people had gathered. His voice carried easily. "There are 43 unmarried women in this county between the ages of 16 and 35. There are 68 unmarried men, most of whom have been on this frontier long enough to know they need a proper household to survive the winter." He paused to let that settle. "We're going to solve that problem today." Mara heard the woman beside her, Ellen Marsh, who did laundry for half the town, draw a sharp breath. "Every unmarried woman will present herself on this stage," Connors continued, gesturing toward the raised wooden platform that had been used for cattle auctions and public announcements for as long as anyone could remember. "The eligible men of Black Hollow will observe and make their selections known. Those who are chosen will have the option to accept or decline, and arrangements will be made accordingly. Those who are not chosen," he shrugged slightly, "are free to go about their day." There was murmuring. Not protest exactly, the kind of murmuring that happens when people are uneasy but not quite uncomfortable enough to say so out loud. Mara's stomach turned over. She was not afraid of much, practically speaking. She'd grown up without a father, with a mother who said things to her that Mara had spent years trying to unhear, and she'd survived both. Fear of the abstract, of what people thought, of public humiliation, that was different. That kind of fear lived in her throat. She looked for an exit from the crowd and found that the press of bodies had closed in behind her while she wasn't paying attention. They called the women up one by one. The first few were the obvious ones. Clara Higgins, who was 17 and blonde, and who looked at her shoes the whole time with pink cheeks. The men near the front straightened up visibly. Tom Aldridge's boy raised his hand so fast he nearly knocked the hat off his own head. Then Vera Sullivan, who was 20 and had 3 suitors already, but whose father had declared none of them suitable. Vera stepped onto the stage like she was walking into a room she'd already decorated in her mind, and half the crowd smiled at her just for showing up. Mara watched all of it from the back of the gathering, trying to become invisible through sheer concentration. Mara Ellison. She heard her name the same way you hear a door slam, a physical sensation more than a sound. She didn't move right away. Mara Ellison, the deputy called again, reading off the paper in his hand, scanning the crowd. The woman standing next to her, a rancher's wife named Patricia, whose name Mara barely knew, turned and looked directly at her, then back at the stage, then back at Mara, as if calculating the distance between where she was and where she was supposed to be. Mara walked. She kept her eyes straight ahead and walked through the crowd, which parted for her not with any particular courtesy, but with the instinctive way people move away from something they don't want to be associated with. She heard, as she passed, a small cluster of young women near the water trough. She caught 2 words clearly. Oh no. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The sunlight hit her full in the face, and she stood there, and she let herself be looked at because there was nothing else to do. She was a big woman, not merely heavy, which she also was, but big in the frame, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been calloused since she was 12. Her hair was dark and thick, and she'd pinned it up that morning with the care she always took, which hadn't seemed to amount to much because half of it had already escaped. She wore her town dress, which was clean and well-mended and simply, plainly, not the kind of dress that made men stand up straighter. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then someone laughed. Just one person, initially. But laughter moves through a crowd the way sparks move through dry grass. And within 10 seconds there were enough people smiling or chuckling that the noise of it became its own weather system settling over the square. Mara stood in the middle of it. She kept her chin up. She didn't know why exactly. Stubbornness, maybe, or the remnant of some dignity she hadn't managed to surrender completely. She looked out over the faces of the people she had lived among her entire life and thought, with a clarity she hadn't expected, I will not cry. Not here. Not in front of any of you. She didn't. Sheriff Connors, to his minor credit, called for order. The laughing subsided to the level of ambient noise. No hand went up. No man stepped forward. Next, the deputy said, after a pause that was 6 seconds too long. She stepped down off the stage and walked back through the crowd, which closed in behind her again, and she found a space near the edge of the gathering where she could breathe without anyone standing directly on top of her. Her hands were steady. She made them be. She stood there for another 40 minutes, watching the rest of the selection, because leaving would have meant pushing through people, and she couldn't do that right then. She watched 8 more women go up, and 3 of them get spoken for before the proceedings wound down, and people began to drift back toward their ordinary afternoons. Her mother found her afterward. Ruth Ellison was a small woman, narrow-boned, who had been considered handsome when she was young, and had never entirely accepted that the years had complicated that. She appeared at Mara's elbow with the look of someone who has been saving up something to say. Well, Ruth said. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She had a particular gift for the unfinished statement, for the pause that was precisely shaped to fit every humiliating thing her daughter already knew about herself. I have to get back to the store, Mara said. Fletcher's going to close early. I saw him leaving. Then I'll go home. I'm fine, Mama. Ruth pressed her lips together. I just want you to understand that this isn't, there were many women not selected today. It isn't a reflection of, I'm going home, Mara said. Not sharply. She didn't have the energy for sharp. She said it the way she said most things, quietly, flatly, with the door already half closed. She walked back through town without looking at anyone's face. The house she shared with her mother was at the north edge of Black Hollow, where the town sort of gave up on itself and dissolved into scrub brush and hard-packed dirt. It had 3 rooms and a fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the east, and a small garden plot out back where Mara grew tomatoes and whatever else would consent to live in the Nevada soil. She sat at the kitchen table that evening without lighting a lamp. The sun went down slowly, the way it did in Nevada in late summer, the sky going through orange and red and a particular shade of purple that she'd always thought was beautiful and never said so out loud. She sat in that fading light and thought about nothing for a while, which was a skill she'd developed over many years and which was different from being at peace. She was not at peace, She thought about the laughter. She thought about the exact sound of it, how it had started with one voice and multiplied, how it had not been cruel in any deliberate way, which almost made it worse. They hadn't laughed at her because they hated her. They'd laughed because it was funny to them, because the idea of anyone choosing her was funny. She thought about what her life would look like 10 years from now. 20. She thought about the cedar chest with her grandmother's dress inside it. And she thought about the tomatoes in the garden. And she thought about the 60 cents a week that Fletcher Dodd paid her. And she thought, is this it? Is this all of it? She didn't have an answer. She usually didn't. She got up after a while and lit the lamp and put water on for tea and began moving through the ordinary motions of an ordinary evening, because that was the only thing available to her. The next morning, she found out about Colt Mercer. She hadn't been at the square when he arrived. She'd left before the tail end of the proceedings. But Ellen Marsh came into the dry goods store before 8 o'clock, her laundry basket balanced on her hip, with the bright-eyed expression of someone carrying a story they've been awake all night waiting to tell. "You missed the end of it," Ellen said, setting her basket down and leaning on the counter like she was settling in for a while. "I had to get back." Colt Mercer came late. Mara looked up from the ledger. Colt Mercer was not someone she knew personally. Nobody in Black Hollow knew him personally, exactly. He was the kind of man people knew about, which was different. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, several thousand acres east of town on land he'd worked since he was barely out of boyhood. He came to town maybe 4 times a year, bought what he needed, said what he had to say to whoever he had to say it to, and left. He was not, as far as anyone could tell, interested in Black Hollow's opinion of him. "He came to the selection?" Mara said. "Connor sent for him specifically, made some case about community responsibility, leading by example, all of that." Ellen shook her head. "You should have seen his face when he got there, like he'd bitten into something and wasn't sure yet if it was going to make him sick." Mara set down her pencil. "What did he do?" Ellen's expression shifted into something complicated. Not quite approval, not quite bewilderment. "He told Connors to his face that he didn't think the whole business was right. Right there in front of everyone. Said women weren't livestock, and he didn't see why they should be displayed like any. He said that. Said it loud enough that the Morrison boy's mother got so flustered she knocked over her own chair." Ellen allowed herself a small smile. "Then Connors got red in the face and said Mercer could either participate or he could take his business needs to the county seat for the next 5 years, because he'd make sure Mercer's freight contracts didn't come through this district." Mara was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant threat." "It is. Connors knows every freight operator between here and the railroad." Ellen paused, drawing the moment out with the instinct of a natural storyteller. "So Mercer looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the stage. And then—" She stopped. "Ellen." He asked if all the women had already gone up. Mara felt something shift in the room, some quality of the air. "And?" "The deputy told him most of them had. Said the only ones left were the ones nobody'd chosen." Ellen looked at her carefully. He asked who they were. Deputy read the names. Yours was on the list. The shop was very quiet. Outside, a wagon was passing, its wheels grinding on the packed dirt street. "He chose you," Ellen said. "He stepped up to that stage and he put his hand up and he said your name." Mara heard the words. She understood them individually. Together, in that arrangement, they made no sense to her at all. "That's not—" she started. "Happened yesterday afternoon, about 4 o'clock. Ellen picked up her basket. "He's coming to see you this morning, I expect. Or he said he was. I heard him tell Connors he'd be speaking to you directly." She left the way she'd come, in the efficient manner of someone who has delivered their news and has laundry to get back to. Mara stood behind this counter of the dry goods store in the early morning light and tried to locate a thought that made sense. She found only questions. Why? Why her, when there had been prettier women, younger women, women whose appearance would not have made the crowd laugh? Why, unless— She stopped herself before she could finish that thought. She'd learned a long time ago that certain thoughts were best not completed. He came in at 9:30. She knew who he was the moment he walked through the door, even though she'd seen him in person maybe twice in her life, and both times only at a distance. He was taller than she'd remembered, or maybe that was the doorframe making him look that way. He had to angle slightly to come in. And he straightened up once he was inside with the careful deliberateness of a man who'd done that so many times it had become automatic. He was maybe 35, dark from sun, with the particular wear that frontier work puts on a person that is different from age. It was a wearing in, like leather, rather than a wearing out. He looked at her directly. That was the first thing she noticed. Not past her, not around her, not with the reflexive slide away that most people's eyes did when they landed on her face. He looked at her directly, and he said, "Miss Ellison." "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. He came to the counter. He didn't put his hands on it the way men usually did. That proprietary lean, like they were claiming surface area. He stood a foot back upright, with his hat in his hands. "I expect you've heard," he said. "I have." "Then I won't waste your time explaining it." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not apology, not the specific condescension of a man who thinks he's doing a poor woman a favor. Something more like assessment. The way a person looks at a fence line to judge if it'll hold. "I need someone at the ranch. I run it alone right now, and I've been running it alone for 2 years since my foreman left, and I'm falling behind. I need a second pair of hands and a second pair of eyes, and someone with a head for keeping accounts." Yet, Mara said nothing. "I'm not going to dress that up into something it isn't," he continued. "I chose you because you're not spoken for, and because Fletcher Dodd says you're the best with numbers he's ever hired, and because—" He stopped for a moment, as if deciding how honest to be. "Because you were the only person on that stage who didn't look at me like you were waiting to see what I'd give you." She absorbed that. "You didn't stay to the end," she said finally. "You didn't see me go up." "I saw you go up," he said. "I was at the back of the crowd. I saw the whole thing." She felt her jaw tighten. "Then you saw what happened." "I did." "And that didn't—" she started, then stopped, because she wasn't sure how to finish the question without saying something she'd rather not say. "No," he said simply. "It didn't." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. The shop smelled of soap and dried corn and the particular dustiness of burlap, and outside a child was yelling something at another child, and the wagon that had passed earlier was passing back the other way. "I'll need to think about it," she said. He nodded. "I'll be at the inn for another day. You know where to find me." He put his hat back on. He had the specific economy of movement of someone who doesn't waste any more physical effort than necessary, and he turned to go. At the door, without turning back, he said, "For what it's worth, Miss Ellison, I know what it looks like when people laugh at something because it genuinely doesn't occur to them to take it seriously. That wasn't why I made the choice I made." He left. The bell above the door rang once, then settled. Mara stood very still behind the counter for a full minute. Then she went to the back of the store, sat down on a crate of flour sacks, and pressed her hands flat on her knees and thought about the cedar chest at home with the dress inside it, and the 60 cents a week, and the tomatoes in the garden, and what her life would look like in 10 years. She thought about the way he'd looked at her. Not through her, not past her. At her. She thought about the stage, and the laughter, and the 4 seconds of silence before it started. Then she got up, smoothed her skirt, went back out front, and finished the morning's inventory count because the flour order was due before noon and she hadn't written it up yet. But she already knew, sitting there on that flour sack, what her answer was going to be. She just needed a few more hours to be sure she wasn't making it for the wrong reasons. She went to see him that evening. She didn't tell her mother where she was going, which wasn't difficult because Ruth had already retreated to her room by the time the sun finished setting, and the two of them had an unspoken arrangement about not accounting for each other's movements when the day had already been hard enough. Mara put on her town dress again, the same one she'd worn the day before, which she'd brushed and rehung carefully, and walked through Black Hollow in the long blue dusk with her hands in her pockets and her mind working. The inn was on the main street between the telegraph office and the saddle shop, a 2-story building with a covered porch where men sometimes sat in the evenings to smoke and watch nothing in particular happen. 2 of them were there when she arrived, and they both looked at her and she looked back, and nobody said anything. She asked for Mercer at the front desk. The woman behind it, a heavy-set widow named Greta, who'd run the inn for 12 years, and who had, in Mara's estimation, seen absolutely everything there was to see in Black Hollow, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it, told her he was in the dining room finishing supper. He was. He was sitting at the far table with a cup of coffee and a map spread out in front of him, weighted at the corners with a salt shaker and 2 spoons. He looked up when she came in and didn't appear startled, which she appreciated. "Miss Ellison," he said, and moved the map to make room across from him. "Sit down if you want." She sat. He waited. That was another thing she noticed about him. He had the ability to simply wait without filling the silence with noise, which was rarer than people understood. "I'll come," she said. "I want to be clear about what I'm agreeing to and what I'm not. I'll work the ranch. I'll keep the accounts. I'll learn whatever needs learning." She paused. "I won't be a servant." "I'm not looking for one," he said. "And I won't pretend to be something I'm not to make it more comfortable for either of us." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one. "I'd consider that a waste of time," he said. "Then we understand each other." "I think we might," he said. She went home, told her mother the next morning over coffee that she was leaving, endured the particular variety of silence that Ruth deployed when she had a great deal to say, and had decided that saying none of it was somehow more devastating, and packed her 2 traveling bags with everything she owned that mattered. It wasn't much. It fit easily. She left the cedar chest. But the Mercer Ranch was 11 miles east of Black Hollow, which in Nevada meant it existed in a world that was almost entirely different from the town. The landscape changed in the way Nevada landscape always changed. Not gradually, but suddenly. The scrub giving way to longer grass, the horizon flattening and then lifting into low brown hills, the sky getting bigger somehow, wider, as if it had been waiting until you were far enough from town before it showed you what it actually was. Colt drove the wagon himself. He didn't talk much on the way out, which suited Mara fine because she was busy looking at everything. She cataloged it the way she cataloged the stock at the dry goods store, systematically, with attention to detail, because she understood that knowing your inventory was the first requirement of doing anything useful with it. The ranch house was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't formed a strong expectation. It was low and solid, built of timber and adobe, with a wide porch that faced west to catch the afternoon shade. It was also, obviously, in need of attention. The porch rail on the east side had rotted through and been replaced with a piece of rope. The window shutters were warped. The kitchen garden, which she could see from the drive, had been taken over by weeds to the extent that she couldn't immediately identify anything intentional growing in it. She didn't say anything about any of this. She filed it. "I'll show you where things are," Colt said, climbing down. "Then you can tell me what questions you have." He showed her the house first. 3 rooms, plus a sleeping loft, plus a back storage room that smelled of old harness leather and dried tobacco. There was a second room off the kitchen that had been used at some point for something other than storage, but currently contained 4 broken chairs and a collection of crates that appeared to have been stacked without any organizing principle at all. "That can be your room," he said, "if you want to clear it out." She looked at the crates. "Where does all this go?" "I'll move it to the barn." "Tonight?" He looked at her. "If you need the room tonight, yes." "I can sleep in the loft for now," she said. "There's no rush." She moved one of the crates experimentally. Heavy, tools by the feel of it, or parts. "I'll help you move them when we get to it. Don't leave it all for yourself." He was quiet for a moment. "All right." The barn was larger than the house, which made sense given what the ranch was built around. 38 head of cattle, he told her, 7 horses, 2 of which were working stock, and the rest kept for various purposes. He described in the efficient shorthand of someone who'd been explaining the same things to himself for years and had stopped finding ways to make them interesting. There was also a stretch of fencing on the north pasture that needed repair, a water situation that he described as complicated without elaborating, and the small matter of a breeding agreement with a rancher named Sutton 2 counties over that had produced a contract Colt could not make sense of. "What's unclear about it?" she asked. "I'm not certain I understood what I was signing," he said, with a flatness that indicated he found this neither embarrassing nor amusing, just a fact, like the warped shutters to be dealt with. "Do you have the paperwork?" "It's in the house somewhere." "Find it," she said. "I'll read it." He looked at her again with that same expression from the store, assessment, but not unfriendly, like he was updating some internal ledger. "All right," he said again. "But don't The first week was difficult in ways she'd expected and difficult in ways she hadn't. She expected the physical part to be hard. She hadn't worked animals before, not really. The closest she'd come was Fletcher Dodd's mule, which she'd occasionally helped lead around the back of the store when deliveries came. The horses were a different matter entirely. Mercer's working horses were large, seasoned animals with opinions about everything, and the first time she tried to saddle the gray gelding he called Pitch, the horse turned his head and looked at her with an expression of such comprehensive skepticism that she nearly laughed. "He does that to everyone," Colt said from the other side of the barn, not looking up from what he was doing. "Does it mean something?" "Means he's not sure about you yet. How do I convince him?" "Do what you say you're going to do," Colt said. "Every time. Don't flinch. Don't rush. Don't make promises you can't keep." He glanced over. "Works on horses and most other things." She thought about that more than once in the days that followed. What she hadn't expected was how quiet the ranch was at night. She'd grown up in a house where silence was a loaded weapon, where her mother's quiet meant something specific and generally unpleasant. The silence at the ranch was different. At night, with the window cracked, she could hear the horses moving in the barn and the particular sound the high desert made when the wind dropped, something between nothing and breathing, and it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the world had simply paused to rest. She wasn't used to that. She couldn't sleep the first 3 nights. She lay in the loft on the narrow cot that Colt had set up for her and stared at the rafters and listened to the silence and thought about whether she'd made a mistake. Not the decision itself. She had a high tolerance for hard decisions once she'd made them, but whether she'd read the situation correctly, whether she'd been wrong about his reasons for choosing her. On the 4th morning, she went to make coffee before dawn and found him already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and the Sutton contract spread in front of him and a pen in his hand and an expression of concentrated frustration. "I thought I'd figure it out," he said, without looking up. "Did you?" "No." She sat down across from him and turned the contract to face her. It was 6 pages, handwritten in a crabbed script that suggested Sutton's lawyer had either very poor eyesight or very poor intentions. She read through it twice without speaking. "He's claiming breeding rights to the first 3 seasons," she said. "Not just this one. And there's a clause here that says, if the bull produces fewer than 40 viable calves in the first year, you owe him compensation at a rate he gets to calculate." Colt was very still. "That's not what he told me." "I imagine it isn't. Can it be contested?" "It can be if you didn't have independent counsel review it before you signed, and it's clear from the language here that you didn't." She turned the last page over. "When was this signed?" 3 weeks ago? Then you have time. There's a 30-day window here in Section 4. I think he put it in to protect himself, but it works both ways. You can file a notice of dispute with the county recorder before the window closes, and it freezes the contract terms until it's reviewed. She looked up. "Do you know anyone at the county recorder's office?" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I don't know many people." "Then we'll go to the county seat," she said, "before the 30 days are up." He looked at her over the lamp. The flame was low and the light it cast was orange and unsteady, and his face in that light was hard to read, but she thought she saw something loosen in it slightly, some held tension releasing, not dramatically, just the way a rope goes when you ease the pressure. "I've been trying to work that out for 3 weeks," he said. "I know, I can see the coffee rings on the paper." He looked down at this contract. There were, in fact, 3 overlapping rings from cups set down over the course of multiple evenings. "I should have told you about it right away." "Yes," she said. "You should have." A beat of quiet. "I'm not good at asking for help," he said. "I noticed." She stood and went to make the coffee that was ostensibly why she'd come downstairs. "I'm not good at assuming I'm wanted around," she said, with her back to him. "So we can either both be bad at our respective things separately, or we can try something else." He didn't respond immediately. Then, "Something else." "Good," she said. "Then tell me the rest of what's wrong with this ranch. All of it, not just the contract." He told her. It took almost an hour, the coffee going cold beside them, and it was more than she'd expected. The water situation turned out to involve a disputed irrigation line, and there were 3 additional agreements she hadn't known about, and the financial accounts were kept in a ledger that she would later describe to herself as creative, in the way that meant the opposite of organized. But she listened to all of it, and she asked questions when she needed to. And she did not let her expression show anything that could have been read as judgment about the state of things. When he finished, he said, "It's worse than I made it sound at the inn." "I figured it might be," she said. "I still came." "Why?" She thought about the flour sack she'd sat on in the back of the dry goods store, and the cedar chest, and the 60 cents a week. She thought about the 4 seconds of silence before the crowd started laughing. "Because this is something I can do something about," she said, "and I haven't had many of those." Yet, the second week was harder physically than the first. She had insisted on learning the full range of what the ranch required, and Colt had taken her at her word in a way she suspected most people hadn't. He didn't water down the instruction or skip the difficult parts or suggest she might want to start smaller. He showed her how to check the cattle's hooves for infection, how to read the water trough levels, how to patch fence wire properly so it held instead of just appearing to hold. Her hands blistered, and then the blisters tore, and then they healed into something tougher, which she regarded without sentiment as a reasonable trade. She fell off pitch on the 9th day. She'd been pushing her seat too hard, trying to compensate for an uneven canter with tension instead of adjustment, and the horse simply stepped sideways, and she went down hard on her left side in the dirt of the practice yard. She lay there for a moment taking inventory. Nothing broken, significant bruising forming along her hip and shoulder, and then she got up. Colt was by the fence. He'd seen it happen. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes." "You want to—" "No," she said, and went and got back on the horse. He didn't say anything after that. But later when she came in from the barn that evening and her left side was stiff enough that she was visibly favoring it, he produced a small tin of liniment from somewhere and set it on the table without comment and went back to what he was doing. She used it. Her shoulder felt considerably better the next morning. She didn't thank him. He hadn't asked her to. The thing about Colt Mercer that she hadn't been able to see from a distance, and that Black Hollow, in its various opinions about him, had also apparently missed, was that he was a man carrying a significant amount of weight and doing it poorly, in the way that people do when they've been carrying things alone for so long they've stopped noticing the strain. She found out about his brother by accident, the way you find out most things at a ranch, by being around long enough that the ordinary evidence of people's lives becomes readable. There was a photograph in the main room tucked between 2 books on the shelf, partially obscured. She'd noticed it in her first week, but hadn't looked closely until the evening she was reorganizing the shelf to make room for the ledger book she was consolidating. She took it down and looked at it without thinking. 2 young men, maybe 20 and 16, standing in front of a fence that looked like an earlier version of the North Pasture fence. The older one was clearly Colt. The younger one had the same jaw and the same way of standing, straight-backed but not rigid, like someone comfortable in their body. She put the photograph back where she'd found it. At supper, they ate together, because the alternative was eating at separate times in the same small house, which was more awkward than eating together. She didn't say anything about it. But later, when they were both on the porch watching the dark come in, she asked, "How long have you been running the ranch alone?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since my brother left, 2.5 years. "Where did he go?" "North, Montana." He said it in a flat way that didn't invite follow-up, and she didn't follow up. But she understood, from the tone and from the photograph and from the general shape of what a person looked like when something had been taken out of their life, that it hadn't been a simple departure. "I had a sister once," she said, which surprised herself somewhat, because she never talked about Addie. "She died when I was 8, fever." He looked at her. "I don't remember her face very well anymore," Mara said. "I remember her hands. She had small hands." She paused. "I used to think I was taking up the space that should have been hers, that my mother would have loved me more if Addie had been the one who lived." She wasn't sure why she'd said that. It was more than she usually said to anyone. Colt looked back at the horizon. "Do you still think that?" "Sometimes," she said. "Less than I used to." The dark came in fully. Somewhere out in the pasture, one of the cattle made a low sound, and another answered. "My brother didn't leave because he wanted to," Colt said eventually. "He left because I made it impossible for him to stay. I had ideas about how things should be done, and I wasn't wrong exactly, but I wasn't right in the way I went about it." He stopped. "I thought being right about something meant you didn't have to worry about how you treated people while you were being right." Mara turned this over. "Did you tell him that after?" "I wrote him a letter." "Did he write back?" "Not yet." "That's not a no." she said. He looked at her sideways. No, he said, it's not. They sat there a while longer in the specific companionship of two people who have said more than they meant to and are not entirely sorry about it. Well, it was on the third week that Black Hollow found its way back to them, which Mara had been expecting and which was, when it came, still slightly worse than she'd prepared for. A man named Holt Briggs arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning. Briggs was one of those men that frontier towns produce with some regularity. Loud voice, confident manner, the specific energy of someone who believes that other people's business is fundamentally his business if he finds it interesting enough. He ran a small freight operation out of Black Hollow and had some indefinite social arrangement with Sheriff Connors that gave him an unofficial air of authority he exercised whenever possible. He rode into the yard while Mara was mending the east fence, which put her visible position between him and the house. She straightened up and watched him come. Miss Ellison, he said, pulling up his horse with rather more drama than the situation required. Didn't expect to find you at fence work. Then you didn't think very hard about it, she said. He blinked. Men like Briggs were not accustomed to that response from Mara Ellison specifically, which was itself informative. He recovered quickly enough. Men like him always did. Mercer around? He's in the north pasture. I'll wait then. He swung down off his horse with the air of someone who has not considered the possibility of not being welcome and began walking toward the porch as if he'd been there before. You're welcome to wait in the yard, Mara said. He stopped. I beg your pardon? The house isn't open to visitors right now. You can wait in the yard, or you can ride out to the north pasture and find him yourself. It's about a mile. Keep the fence line to your left. She watched his face go through several things. Settlement, she'd found, had a particular system for managing women who surprised it, and the system involved a staged series of reactions. First confusion, then mild offense, then the assessment of whether outright dismissal was socially available. Briggs went through all three in about 4 seconds and arrived at something that wasn't quite any of them. Mercer know you talk to his visitors like that? He asked. I imagine he'd think it was reasonable, she said, but you're welcome to ask him. Briggs stood in the yard for 20 minutes until Colt rode in. She watched from the fence where she'd gone back to work without making it obvious she was watching. She couldn't hear this conversation from that distance. She could read the shape of it. Briggs's posture was the expansive posture of someone delivering a message they enjoy delivering, and Colt's was the closed, still posture of a man receiving something unwelcome without letting it show on his face. At one point, Briggs gestured toward Mara, and Colt looked at her briefly and then back at Briggs and said something short. Briggs left without looking at her again. She kept working. Colt unsaddled his horse and put it up and came to the fence. Connors wants to see me in town, he said. About what? About the arrangement, he said, with the particular flatness of someone using someone else's word with something less than respect. Briggs says there are people in town with opinions about the situation here. Apparently there's some concern that it's improper. Mara drove a staple into the fence post. Improper. An unmarried man and woman alone at a ranch 11 miles from town. He said it without expression. You can imagine the conversations. I can, she said. Can you tell him to mind his own business? I could, but Connors controls the freight contracts, and I still need... I know. She stepped back and looked at the fence line. Let me come with you. He looked at her. That might make it worse. Maybe. But they're already talking, so there's nothing to protect by leaving me behind. She turned to face him. And I'm not interested in being the person who stays home while decisions get made about her. He studied her for a moment. All right, he said, for the third time. He said it the same way each time, not easily, but with a kind of settled certainty, like a man who has decided something and doesn't feel the need to perform it. She nodded and went back to the fence, but she was already thinking about Black Hollow, about the square and the stage and the laughter, and what it was going to cost her to walk back into all of it, because she knew now, 3 weeks in, that the person who would be walking back was not quite the same person who had left. She wasn't sure yet what had changed exactly. She couldn't have named it with precision, but she could feel it the way you feel a healed bone. Something that used to shift painfully under pressure had gone solid. Not comfortable necessarily, not easy, solid. She finished the fence as the sun passed noon and the Nevada sky went white and wide above her, and she did not let herself think past the next thing, which was to do the work in front of her. There would be time for Black Hollow. There was always time for the things you'd been putting off. They left for Black Hollow on a Thursday morning, early enough that the sun was still low and the air had that particular cold edge to it that the Nevada desert produced overnight and kept until about 8 o'clock, when it burned off and became something else entirely. Mara wore her town dress again. She'd considered, briefly, wearing the work clothes she'd been wearing every day for 3 weeks. The heavy canvas trousers she'd borrowed from a spare set Colt kept in the barn. The shirts she'd had to take in at the shoulders to fit properly. But she'd decided against it. Not because she cared what Black Hollow thought she looked like exactly, but because she understood the strategic value of not giving people additional things to talk about before you'd even opened your mouth. She did her hair more carefully than usual. She acknowledged this fact to herself without assigning meaning to it. The ride into town was quiet. The land was doing its early morning thing, the light coming in flat and gold across the grasses, the hills to the east looking closer than they were, the way the sky in Nevada seemed to start immediately above your head rather than at a distance. She'd grown up looking at this landscape and had never paid it much attention. Now she found herself looking at it differently. The way you look at a room when you've rearranged the furniture and everything familiar sits at a new angle. "I want to hear what he says before I say anything," she told Colt, about 2 miles outside of town. He nodded. "I'm telling you because I might look like I'm being quiet for reasons I'm not," she said. "I'm not intimidated by Connors. I just want information first." "I know," he said. "You don't know me well enough to know that." "I know it better than you might think," he said. She let that sit without examining it too hard. They went to the sheriff's office directly, not stopping in town first, which Mara had suggested and Colt had agreed to because the alternative was walking through Black Hollow with people looking at them, which would happen eventually but didn't need to happen in a preparatory way. Sheriff Connors was at his desk. He had the careful, managed expression of a man who is prepared for a conversation and is now performing his preparation, which Mara had always found more alarming than genuine emotion because it indicated a person who had already decided the outcome. "Mercer," he said. Then, with a fractional pause that was itself a kind of commentary, "Miss Ellison." "Sheriff," Colt said. Connors gestured at the 2 chairs across from his desk. They sat. Mara kept her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face neutral, which she was good at. "I'll be direct," Connors said, which in Mara's experience meant he intended to be indirect. "There have been concerns raised by members of this community about the nature of the arrangement at your ranch. An unmarried man and an unmarried woman living under one roof without appropriate sanction." He folded his hands on the desk. "I understand the original intention was well-meaning, but the reality of the situation is that it's created talk, and talk affects the community's sense of its own." "Order," Colt said. "I was going to say cohesion." "Same thing. In your accounting." Connors' jaw tightened very slightly. "I'm not here to argue philosophy, Mercer. I'm here to tell you that either you formalize the arrangement or you dissolve it. Those are the options available." "Formalize meaning marry," Mara said. Connors looked at her. He had the specific expression of a man who has been interrupted by someone he did not expect to participate. "It would be the most straightforward resolution, yes." "And dissolve meaning I go home," she said. "Yes." "What is the timeline on this decision?" Connors blinked. She could see him recalibrating, adjusting for the fact that she was asking logistical questions rather than the things he'd evidently prepared to address. Tears, perhaps, or argument, or appeals to his sense of decency, which she suspected was not extensive anyway. "I'd want an answer within the week," he said. "All right," she said. "We'll give you one." She stood, which meant Colt stood, and they left before Connors had entirely finished processing the conversation. Outside on the sheriff's porch, in the mid-morning sun, Colt looked at her. "That was efficient," he said. "He'd made up his mind before we walked in," she said. "Anything I said that he wasn't expecting just bought us time." She stepped down off the porch. "I need to think." She walked. Not toward any particular destination, but through Black Hollow's main street the way she'd walked it 1,000 times before, because she needed the rhythm of it, and because she wanted to see what it looked like now, whether it had changed, or whether she had. It had not changed. Same storefronts, same warped boardwalk, same geography of social positioning she'd been navigating her entire life. Mrs. Alcott's dress shop, where Mara had been told twice that they didn't carry her size. The feed store where the men gathered in the mornings with their coffee. The square, visible at the far end of the street, with the stage still standing. She was aware of being looked at. It was the particular awareness of a person who has always been looked at in one specific way and is now being looked at in a way that is slightly but significantly different. The same volume, but a different frequency. Before, she had been looked at as an inevitability, the way you look at weather you've already accounted for. Now she was being looked at with something closer to question. She heard someone say her name quietly as she passed. She didn't turn to find the source. She stopped at the end of the street near the livery and stood with her arms crossed and looked at the stage in the square and thought. She thought with the same systematic methodology she'd learned for everything else that mattered. Identify the real problem, not the surface one, then find the smallest point on which pressure could be meaningfully applied. The real problem was not Connors. Connors was a mechanism. The real problem was that she was an unmarried woman on an unmarried man's ranch, and the community had decided this was a problem. And in 1882, Nevada, the community was not wrong about its authority to say so. The formal structures of property and propriety were real, and she couldn't wish them out of existence any more than she could wish away the busted fence rail on the ranch porch. So the options were the ones Connors had named. She turned them over with the same absence of sentiment she'd applied to the Sutton contract, and she found that they were both simpler than they felt. The question was not which one she wanted. She'd learned, over the years, that what she wanted was not always the most useful data point. The question was which one she could live with, and which one was actually possible. She was walking back to where Colt had remained, near the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, when her mother materialized out of the entrance of the general store with her marketing basket over her arm and the particular expression on her face of someone who has been watching for exactly this opportunity. Mara. Mama. Ruth walked toward her with the compressed urgency of a small woman whose social antennae had been vibrating for 3 weeks. I heard you were in town. You should have come to the house. I had business with the sheriff. Her mother's eyes moved. Tamara's clothes, her hair, her hands, the direction she'd come from. Ruth had always been capable of assembling significant intelligence from minimal evidence. You look different, she said. I've been working outside. It's not the color. Ruth frowned, which was not unusual, but the nature of the frown was different from the ones Mara was accustomed to. You're standing different. Mara didn't have a response to that. This whole thing, Ruth began, with the air of someone who has rehearsed and is now committing to the rehearsed version despite circumstances, has been... People have been talking, Mara. I don't know what you think you're doing out there, but people are saying... I know what people are saying. Then you understand why I'm... Mama. She said it gently, which surprised her mother into stopping. I understand, and I'll let you know when there's something definitive to know. She paused. I'm all right. I want you to know that. I'm actually... She looked for the right word and found an honest one. Better. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Her expression did something complicated that Mara couldn't entirely interpret. Something moved through it. Some feeling that wasn't quite any of the usual feelings, and then it settled back into the familiar lines. Come to supper when you can, she said finally. I will, Mara said. They separated on the main street, going different directions, which felt true to the nature of things. She found Colt at the hitching post and told him what she'd thought through, methodically, without preamble. The way I see it, she said, Connors isn't going to be flexible, and the freight contracts matter, and the county connection matters, so fighting him directly is expensive in ways you can't afford right now. She looked at him directly. So the question is what you want to do. He looked back at her with the particular steadiness that she'd come to understand was not distance, but rather the opposite, his version of paying full attention. I know what I want to do, he said. I want to know what you want. She hadn't expected the simple directness of it. She held it for a second, then said, I think we can make it work. If you're asking whether I want to dissolve the arrangement, I don't. All right, he said, then we'll get married. She waited for something more. It didn't come. That's the whole conversation? What else needs saying? Most people say more. I'm not most people, he said, and neither are you. He looked down the street, then back at her. I asked you because I wanted an honest answer, not because I was going to change what I'd already decided. I chose you in that square, and I didn't do it by accident, and I haven't spent 3 weeks regretting it. He paused. That's the whole conversation. Mara looked at a point above his shoulder for a moment, out at the middle distance where the hills began. Then she looked back at him. I want a working partnership, she said. I don't want it to be a transaction on either side. It's not, he said. And I want to keep the accounts, she said. And I want to know everything about the ranch, not just the parts you decide are appropriate for me to know. That was always the arrangement. I want it said plainly. Then it's said plainly. She nodded once. All right, she said. Let's tell Connors. The marriage was performed by the county judge 2 days later in Black Hollow's Civic Hall, which also served as the post office, and, on alternate Fridays, a venue for the Ladies' Improvement Society. It was not an elaborate ceremony. There were no flowers. Mara wore the cedar chest dress, which turned out to be a deep burgundy wool that fit her well enough after she'd taken in the waist, and which was the nicest thing she owned. When she'd opened the chest to get it, the evening before, back at the house in town, after Colt had gone back to the ranch to see to the animals, her mother had come and stood in the doorway and watched her lift the dress out and shake the cedar smell loose. Ruth said nothing for a long time. Then she said, Your grandmother would have wanted you to have it for your wedding. I know, Mara said. She'd have liked him, I think. He seems like a man who knows what he wants. Mara smoothed the fabric over her arm. He is. Another silence. Then Ruth said very quietly, with the specific difficulty of a woman who has spent 30 years weaponizing silence and is attempting, for perhaps the first time in Mara's memory, to say something without the weapon. I didn't mean for it to be so hard. For you. I don't know if I didn't mean to. Mara looked at her mother. Ruth was looking at the dress, not at her, which made it possible. I know, Mara said. Which was true. Meaning didn't have much to do with it, but it was still true. They didn't hug. They had never been people who hugged, but they stood in the same doorway for another minute, looking at the same dress, and that was something. The ceremony took 11 minutes. There were no guests, by design. Mara had asked Colt, and he'd agreed immediately, which confirmed her assessment of him. Connors had sent the deputy, who functioned as a witness and who had the expression of someone unsure what to do with the occasion. The judge was named Farrow, and he was efficient and impersonal and mispronounced Mara's last name, which she corrected once and he corrected, and then they proceeded. When it was done, Colt looked at her and said, You hungry? Extremely, she said. They ate at the inn, the same table he'd been sitting at when she'd come to find him that first evening, with the map weighted at the corners with a salt shaker and spoons. The map was gone. They ordered the beef stew, which was competent if not exceptional, and Mara drank 2 cups of coffee and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the chair she was sitting in was one she'd chosen. But, the weeks that followed were the hardest and the truest she'd ever lived. Not because things went wrong. Some things did go wrong, in the ordinary way of ranches and weather and animals and machinery that was older than it should be. The complication with the Sutton contract got resolved at the county seat in exactly the way she'd predicted, which gave her a satisfaction so clean it almost embarrassed her. The water dispute turned out to involve a third party, a man named Cates, who held a prior claim on the northern irrigation channel that nobody had thought to tell Colt about when he'd bought the land. And that took 3 weeks and 2 visits from a county surveyor to sort out, but eventually it sorted. What was hard was something different. It was the daily arithmetic of 2 people who have not been with other people for a long time learning, with very little prior experience between them, how to exist in the same spaces without erasing each other. Colt had a habit of making decisions about the ranch without telling her until after they were made, not from any intention to exclude her, but from the deep solitary grooves of 3 years alone. She called him on it each time, without theatrics, until the habit began to wear down. The north fence, she said one morning, looking at the breakfast table where he'd spread an estimate from a hardware merchant in town. You've already decided on the wire gauge. This gauge holds better. It also costs more per foot, and we're replacing half a mile. She turned the estimate to face him. If you talk to Donnelly at the feed store, He has a stock he can't move at a discount. I saw it when we were in town last week. Slightly heavier gauge, actually, but it's been in his warehouse and he'd take $4 a roll. Colt looked at the estimate, then at her. You saw that last week. I see most things. He was quiet. I should have asked you first.
Yes, she said. I'm not angry. I just need you to stop doing it by accident.
I'm working on it, he said. I know you are. She folded the estimate and handed it back. We'll go talk to Donnelly Thursday. There were things she got wrong too. She was aware of them in herself the way you're aware of a sore muscle. Not always, but when you press on it. She had a tendency to handle problems by retreating into total self-sufficiency, to do things herself rather than say she was struggling, because saying she was struggling had never historically produced anything useful. She fixed things quietly and didn't report it, which meant Colt sometimes didn't know what had been happening. She'd been wrestling with the water pump behind the barn for 2 days. The rod had gone stiff, and she'd been working it by hand each morning because the alternative was telling him it was broken. When he came around the corner of the barn and found her covered in rust, and with her shoulder clearly giving her trouble again. He stopped, looked at the pump, then at her. That's been broken since Tuesday, he said. I've been managing.
I can see that.
He didn't say anything more on the subject of whether she should have told him.
He just took his coat off and hung it on the fence post and crouched down and looked at the mechanism. Get me the wrench, the longer one, in the second drawer. I can... Mara! He said her name simply, looking up at her. Get me the wrench.
She got it. They fixed the pump together in about 40 minutes, which was 37 minutes less than it had taken her alone. When they were done, she sat on the edge of the water trough with her hands in her lap and said, I know it doesn't make sense. What doesn't? Not saying when something's wrong. I know it's counterproductive. He sat down on the trough beside her. It was a long trough. There was room. He was quiet for a while. My brother used to say I made it impossible to help me, he said. I thought he meant I was capable, so he didn't need to. I found out later he meant I made it, uncomfortable, to try. He looked at his hands. Took me 2 years to understand the difference. She thought about that. I've been the wrong kind of strong, she said. Not the useful kind. The kind where you don't let anything show because you've learned that the minute you show something, someone will use it. I know that kind, he said. I know you do. They sat there with rust on their hands and the evening light coming in warm and sideways across the yard, and Mara thought that this was not what she'd imagined a life looking like. This specific unglamorous reality, the broken pump and the earned silence and the fact that her shoulder still hurt, but that it was, despite all of that, or maybe because of all of it, something she could recognize as real. She thought about Pitch. It was Pitch who gave her the truest measure of what had changed. The gray gelding had been skeptical of her from the first morning, and she had worked at his trust the way Colt had told her, consistently, without flinching, without shortcuts. She'd fed him by hand every morning for 2 weeks before she'd tried to saddle him again. She'd let him get used to her smell and her weight, and the particular way she moved, which was not the way any of the ranch hands before her had moved, and which he'd had to recalibrate for. 4 weeks in, she saddled him without incident. 5 weeks in, she took him out alone across the north pasture, the fence line to her left the way Colt had taught her, and let him open up on the flat stretch below the hill. He was fast, faster than she'd expected, the kind of speed that felt less like acceleration and more like the ground simply agreeing to move beneath you. And she stayed with it, stayed loose and balanced and present in the way that had taken her the better part of a month to learn. And the hill came up on the left, and the sky was enormous above her, and Pitch ran. When she pulled him back and he came down to a walk, blowing and satisfied, she sat in the saddle and looked at the hills and the grass and the long geometry of the fences she now knew the entire history of, which wire gauge and which posts and which section had been repaired when and why. She didn't feel like a different person. She'd read enough bad stories to be suspicious of that particular formulation. She felt like herself, but with more room, like someone had opened a window in a house she'd been living in for years without knowing it was closed. She turned Pitch toward the ranch and started back. From halfway across the pasture, she could see Colt at the barn. The specific shape of him she'd learned to read at a distance, the way you learn to read weather. The posture that meant working versus the posture that meant problem. And this was the working posture, head down, the particular rhythm of a man repairing something with full attention. He looked up when he heard the hoofbeats and watched her come in. "Good run?" he asked. "Very," she said. She dismounted without help and led Pitch to the hitching post, and he was already reaching for the bucket without her asking, because they had developed these specific economies between them, the small choreography of people who have learned each other's patterns. It was while she was brushing Pitch down that she let herself think about Black Hollow for the first time in a week. Really think about it, not just the practical elements of the sheriff's requirement or the freight contracts, but the thing underneath all of it, the stage, the laughter, the 4 seconds. She thought about who she'd been standing on that stage, and she thought about who was standing in this barn now, and she found that the distance between the two was measurable. Not crossed exactly. You didn't cross that kind of distance so much as you worked on it, but real. The stone that had been sitting behind her sternum for most of her life hadn't vanished, but it had changed weight. She finished with Pitch and hung up the brush and turned around to find Colt leaning against the barn door with his arms crossed, watching her with the look that was, she had learned, not assessment anymore so much as something quieter. The ledger had been updated. He wasn't calculating now. "We need to go back to town at the end of the week," she said. "I want to check on something at the county recorder's office." The Cates claim, "No, that's resolved. Something else." She moved past him toward the house. "I found a reference in the boundary documents we got from the surveyor. There's a secondary land grant notation that doesn't match the plat map. It might be nothing, but you think it isn't." "I think it isn't," she said. "I want to look at the original filings." He straightened up from the door. "What do you think it means?" She stopped at the edge of the porch. The sun was low, and their shadows were long, and she felt, for the first time in the entire chain of events that had brought her here, a different kind of alertness, not the defensive awareness of someone waiting for a blow, but something sharper, more forward-facing. She had seen something in those documents. She didn't know yet what it was, but she knew it mattered. "I think," she said carefully, "that someone may have done something to this land before you bought it that you weren't told about. And I think the person who did it probably counted on the fact that nobody was going to look very hard at the filings." She looked back at him. "I want to look hard." He held her gaze for a moment, with the complete steadiness that she'd finally stopped mistaking for lack of feeling. "Then we'll look hard," he said. She went inside to start supper, and her mind was already at the recorder's office, already running through what she'd seen in the margin of the survey document, already pulling at the thread that she knew with the particular certainty that came from a lifetime of paying close attention to the things other people let slide, was going to lead somewhere significant. She didn't know yet how significant. That would come later, and it would bring Black Hollow with it in ways she was not entirely prepared for, even now. But she was, for the first time in her life, not afraid of what the finding would be. The county recorder's office smelled like old paper and lamp oil, and the specific mustiness of documents that had been filed by people who were now dead and never retrieved by anyone who cared. Mara had been in rooms like this before. The back office of the dry goods store had the same quality, that sense of time compressed into stacks. And she found it neither pleasant nor unpleasant. She found it useful. The clerk was a young man named Aldous, who wore spectacles and had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who had taken a job expecting it to involve less actual work. He brought her the land grant files she asked for without questioning why she wanted them, which she appreciated. People who asked too many questions about what you were looking for in public records were either helpful or nervous, and nervous ones muddied the water. She spread the documents on the reading table and went through them the way she went through everything, systematically, from the oldest filing forward, building the picture in sequence rather than jumping to the part that had caught her eye in the survey document. Colt sat across from her. He was not a natural reader of legal documents, which he'd told her plainly, and so he watched her face instead, which she'd told him was fine and which was true. The original land grant on the Mercer parcel had been issued in 1871 to a man named Voss, Theodore Voss. The grant covered 4,200 acres and was straightforwardly documented. Federal homestead claim, properly filed, properly recorded. Voss had sold to a land broker in 1876, a company called Western Territorial Holdings, whose name appeared in the filing as a single ink stamp
and a signature that was nearly illegible. Mara looked at the stamp for a long time. "Western Territorial Holdings," she said. "I've heard that name," Colt said. "Where?" he thought. Briggs mentioned it once. When he was talking about the Cates water claim, said Cates had some arrangement with them, or used to. She went back to the files. Western Territorial Holdings had held the land for 3 years, from 1876 to 1879, and in that period there were 4 additional filings in the records. Amendments, they were labeled, though amendment was doing significant work as a descriptor for what they actually were. The first 2 were innocuous, boundary clarifications, a surveying correction. The third was a mineral rights notation that was buried in the middle of a page of dense text under a heading that read Addendum C, which was itself appended to a document that was primarily about water access. She read the mineral rights notation twice. "Colt," she said. He leaned forward. "Western Territorial Holdings filed a mineral rights reservation in 1878, she said, before they sold the land to whoever sold it to you. They reserved subsurface extraction rights on the northern third of the parcel." She looked up. "Do you know who you bought from?" "A man named Garrett. He's dead now. Bought it from his estate." "And the estate's representation would have been a lawyer out of Reno. Name of Pickett." Colt's voice had gone careful and flat. "What does the reservation mean?" "It means Western Territorial Holdings, or whoever currently holds their interests, may have a legal claim to whatever is under the ground on your north pasture. And they didn't tell you about it when you bought the land because either the estate's lawyer didn't know, or they did know," Colt said. "Or they did know," she said, and decided not to include it in the disclosure. She looked at the Fourth Amendment. It had been filed 6 weeks after the mineral rights notation, a quiet document, only 1 page, with 2 signatures she didn't recognize and a notary stamp from a county that was not this one. It was a transfer of interest. Western Territorial Holdings had sold their mineral rights reservation to a third party. The third party's name was listed as Connors Land and Development. She sat very still. Colt looked at the document from across the table. He couldn't read the names at that distance, but he could read her face, which had gone the particular careful blank that it went when something important had just rearranged itself in her understanding of things. "What is it?" he said. It wasn't a question. She turned the document to face him and pointed to the name. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat back in his chair and was quiet in the way that a large, controlled man is quiet when something has made him genuinely angry. Not explosive, not loud, but with a heaviness that changed the quality of the air in the room. "Connors," he said. "Connors Land and Development, incorporated in 1877, filing address in Black Hollow." She pulled her notebook from her bag and began writing. "Dale Connors. The sheriff has a land company." "The sheriff has a land company," she said, "that owns mineral rights on your north pasture that he did not disclose to you when he was pressuring you to participate in the bride selection, managing your freight contracts, and generally inserting himself into every decision that affected whether you stayed on this land or left it." The room was very quiet. Aldous was visible through the office window, filing something in the next room with his back turned. "He wanted me to struggle," Colt said. "He wanted you to fail," Mara said. "If the ranch folds, the land reverts through the estate to creditors, and someone with existing subsurface rights and the connections to acquire the property cheaply would be well positioned." She looked at him. "The Sutton contract, the Cates water claim. I thought those were separate problems. I think they might not be." Colt put his hands flat on the table. She'd seen him do that before, when he was working something through, when the process required stillness. "Can you prove any of this?" "Not yet. What I have are documents that show a chain of title and a reservation of interest that should have been disclosed. Whether the non-disclosure was intentional fraud or negligence is a separate question." She tapped the notebook. "I need the original purchase documents from your acquisition. Everything Pickett gave you when you bought from the Garrett estate." "Those are at the ranch." "Then we need to go back and get them." She closed the notebook. "And I need to know one more thing." "What?" "Is there anything under that north pasture? Any reason someone would want mineral rights on it?" He looked at her steadily. "There's a spring. It's been dry 2 seasons, but before that it ran year-round. And there's a rock formation along the north ridge that I always thought was limestone." He paused. "Cates made a comment once.
When we were arguing about the water channel, he said the north parcel was going to be worth more than I thought. She wrote that down too. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was different from their usual silences. Charged rather than settled, the kind that comes when two people are thinking about the same thing from different angles and neither has gotten to the end of their thinking yet. The sun was high and hot, and the hills had gone from gold to brown in the midday light, and Pitch moved under her with the easy rhythm she'd spent weeks learning to trust. She went through the documents in her head the way she'd gone through inventory at the dry goods store, systematically, identifying what was there, what was missing, and what the gap between the two meant. What she had: a chain of titles showing the mineral rights reservation, Connor's name on the transfer document, the pattern of interference, Sutton, Kate's, the bride selection pressure, that made more sense as a coordinated strategy than as coincidence. What she needed: the original purchase documents showing what had and hadn't been disclosed. Some evidence connecting Connors, the person, to Connors' land and development in an active rather than historical capacity. He might claim the company was dormant, or that he'd inherited the interest without knowing. And some third party who could corroborate that the problems Colt had been having were not random bad luck. She thought about Kate's. He'd settled the water dispute without much fight once the surveyor got involved, which at the time she'd taken as a sign that he didn't have a strong case. She wondered now whether he'd back down because the surveyor's presence meant documents were being examined, and examined documents were not in Kate's interest. She thought about Sutton and the contract with its buried clauses and the rate of compensation that Sutton got to calculate himself. Whether Sutton had written that contract alone or whether someone had helped him. She thought about Briggs and what exactly his relationship with Connors consisted of, and whether he was a knowing participant or simply a useful tool. The Sutton contract, she said. Colt looked over at her. The lawyer who drafted it. Did you ever see a name on the letterhead? He thought. There wasn't letterhead. It was handwritten. All 6 pages? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Sutton said his lawyer had been through it, but I never met any lawyer. She filed that. I want to talk to Ellen Marsh, she said. The laundry woman? Why? Ellen Marsh knows everything that happens in Black Hollow, and she was the one who told me about you choosing me in the square. She hears conversations. She's in people's houses. Mara looked at the road ahead. And because she came to the store to tell me about you before 8 o'clock in the morning, which means she'd been holding on to that information since the evening before and was waiting for the moment to deliver it. That's not gossip. That's someone who understands what information is worth and when to use it. Colt was quiet for a moment. You want to use her as a source. I want to know what she knows. Whether she'll tell me is a different question. Mara adjusted her grip on the reins. People like Ellen, they're invisible in a specific way. Men like Connors don't think about what gets overheard by the woman doing their washing. The purchase documents were in the wooden box Colt kept under the bed in the main room. Not the most organized filing system she'd ever encountered, but the documents themselves were intact, which was what mattered. She went through them that evening at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, reading each page twice and making notes. The disclosure statement from Pickett's office was 3 pages. It listed the known encumbrances on the property, the Kate's water arrangement, which was described as informal and non-binding, which it demonstrably was not, a right-of-way agreement for a freight track along the southern boundary, 2 outstanding property tax assessments from 1877 and 1878 that the estate had agreed to settle, no mineral rights reservation, no mention of Western Territorial holdings, no mention of Connors' land and development. She put the disclosure statement down and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you look at something when you want to make sure you're seeing it correctly and not seeing what you expect to see. The mineral rights reservation had been filed in the public record in 1878. Pickett had drafted the disclosure in 1879. Either Pickett hadn't looked, which was possible if the filing was obscure enough, or Pickett had looked and chosen not to include it. Pickett is still practicing in Reno, she said. Probably, Colt said. We need a lawyer who isn't him. I don't know any lawyers. I do, she said, which surprised him. She could see. Fletcher Dodd's nephew passed the bar last year. He's in Carson City. Fletcher mentioned it twice when he was feeling proud.
which means he mentioned it every chance he had. She looked at Colt. Fletcher would give me a letter of introduction. Would he? She thought about the dry goods store, the 60 cents a week, the 3 years she'd kept his accounts better than anyone else he'd ever hired and never asked for more. Yes, she said, he owes me more than a letter. She went to see Fletcher the next morning alone, which Colt had initially resisted and which she'd been firm about. If you come, it becomes about you, she'd said. Fletcher respects me in the specific way that a man respects a woman who has made herself indispensable to his business. That's a particular kind of respect, and it works better without an audience. I don't like you going to Black Hollow by yourself right now. I'm aware of that. She met his eyes. But I'm going. He'd given her a long look and then handed her the rifle he kept by the door. Not because Black Hollow required a rifle, but because it was the only form of objection he had left available to him, and he was a man who needed to do something. She took it. Fletcher was in the store when she arrived, which she'd expected, doing what she'd always done on Monday mornings, tallying the weekend's accounts in the ledger with the particular slow care of a man who was good enough at arithmetic to get through it, but not good enough to find it natural. He looked up when she came in. Mara, he said. Then, with the specific discomfort of a man who is not sure what to call someone who has changed categories, Mrs. Mercer. Fletcher. She didn't sit. She put her hands on the counter the way she'd put her hands on it for 3 years and looked at him directly. I need a letter of introduction to your nephew in Carson City. He blinked. Thomas? What for? Legal matter. I can't say more than that right now. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running through the possibilities. Curiosity competing with the instinct, common to men of his type, to want an explanation before committing to anything. Then something else moved across his face, something that might have been the accumulated weight of 3 years of 60-cent wages. And he pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer under the counter. I'll write it now, he said. While he wrote, she looked at the shelves she'd stocked and restocked for 3 years, the inventory she still knew by heart. The flour sacks were in the same position. The fabric bolts had been reordered by someone who didn't know the system as well as she had. The broadcloth was where the muslin should be. Fletcher blotted the letter and folded it and held it out. He's a good lawyer, he said. Better than he looks, which I say because he's very young. Tell him I said to take it seriously. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Then, as she was turning to go, for what it's worth, I should have paid you more. She looked back at him. I knew you were worth more, he said. He stopped. I should have paid you more. She held the letter in both hands and thought about what she wanted to say, which was several things, and then she thought about what was actually useful. Take better care of your broadcloth, she said. It'll warp if it's next to a window. She left. Behind her, she heard him moving toward the fabric bolts. Tug. It was on her way back through the square toward the hitching post where she'd left her horse that she encountered Connors. He was coming out of his office, which she'd timed badly. Or perhaps not, she thought afterward, perhaps not badly at all. He stopped on the porch when he saw her, and his face did the thing it did when something he hadn't accounted for had appeared in his day. Mrs. Mercer, he said. He still managed to make it sound like a slightly wrong answer. Sheriff. He came down the porch steps. She stood her ground and didn't step back, which seemed to marginally recalibrate something in his approach. He stopped at a distance that was professionally appropriate and looked at her with the expression of a man who is making calculations while his face is doing something neutral. I understand you've been at the recorder's office, he said. She absorbed the fact that he knew this before she'd done anything with the information. Aldous, probably. Or someone who'd seen her horse outside the building. This was a small enough town that both were possible. I was, she said, reviewing the title filings on the Mercer parcel, routine due diligence. And was everything in order? She looked at him steadily. I'm still working through it, she said. These things take time. He watched her for a moment. I hope you and your husband aren't having any difficulties with the property, he said, with the specific warmth of someone who hopes the opposite. Nothing we can't manage, she said. She went past him and got her horse and rode out of Black Hollow without looking back. But her hands were not entirely steady on the reins, and she knew it, and she let herself know it rather than pretending it wasn't true.
Connors was aware she was looking, which meant the window was smaller than she'd thought. He would start moving whatever he needed to move. She pushed the horse to a canter and thought about timelines. Ellen Marsh lived in a small house at the west edge of town with 2 goats and a prodigious washing line that ran from the house to a post 40 feet away and was rarely empty. Mara had stopped there on her way back from Fletcher's. She'd planned to, had calculated the time, and found Ellen in her yard with her arms in a wash basin and the expression of someone who is not surprised to see you because they have been, at some level, expecting you.
I heard you were in town, Ellen said without stopping work. News moves fast. Always did. Ellen wrung out a shirt with practiced efficiency. What do you want to know? Mara appreciated the directness. Connors Land and Development, she said. What do you know about it?
Ellen was quiet for a moment, working. I know Dale Connors runs it, or ran it. I know Briggs had some business with them a while back, but he doesn't talk about it directly, which means it's something he's careful about. She hung the shirt. I know that when Vance Cates was having his water trouble with your husband, he had a meeting with Connors that wasn't in the sheriff's office. It was at Briggs's freight yard, which I know because Briggs's wife asked me to bring washing over that afternoon, and I was there. What did you hear? Not much. I wasn't trying to listen. Ellen reached into the basin. But I heard Kate say your husband's name, and I heard Connors say the word patience twice, which is the word men use when they're asking someone to wait for something they're promising. Mara turned this over. Kate's backed down from the water dispute after the surveyor came, she said. He did, Ellen agreed. Left town about 2 weeks after. Moved up toward Elko, I heard. Is he coming back? Don't know. Ellen looked at her then, setting down the shirt. Mara, what are you doing with all of this? I'm building a record, she said. I have documents. I need witnesses to make the pattern mean something. Ellen looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not simple to read. Something careful in it, something that was weighing costs that Mara might not have full visibility into. Connors has been sheriff here for 11 years, she said. People have tried to push back on him before. What happened? Nothing good? Ellen picked up the shirt again. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying know what you're walking into. I do, Mara said. Or I'm learning. She looked at the washing line, the shirts and trousers shifting in the light wind. Will you testify to what you heard? If it comes to that? The quiet lasted a full 10 seconds. Ask me again when you have something solid, Ellen said. Ask me when it's not just a question, but a fact that needs a voice. Mara nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Ellen said, and put her arms back in the basin. The confrontation happened 4 days later, and it was not one she had planned but should have expected, because things you've set in motion don't always wait for you to be ready. She was in the square, they both were, she and Colt, returning from the feed store with a load of fencing supplies in the wagon, when Connors appeared at the head of a small group of men that included Briggs and 2 others she recognized as Connors' occasional deputies. Men who held no official title, but who had the bearing of people who understood they were there for effect. The square was not empty. It was mid-afternoon and people moved through it on their various errands, and they slowed and stopped in the instinctive way of people who recognize the shape of a confrontation even before they can hear the words. Connors walked to the wagon with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided on a performance and is committed to it. He looked at Colt first, then at Mara. Mercer, he said, I've had some concerns brought to my attention about the title situation on your north parcel. I'm going to need you to come to my office and discuss a potential disputed interest. We can discuss it here, Colt said. A small pause. This was not what Connors had planned for. My office would be more appropriate. Here's fine, Colt said. Connors looked at the people who had stopped to watch, and Mara could see him weighing it. The audience was a complication, but also, she thought, something he believed he could manage. He had managed audiences for 11 years. There's a prior mineral interest on the north section of your parcel, Connors said, with the tone of someone delivering news they're sorry to have to deliver. It appears it wasn't properly disclosed during your acquisition. These things happen, but it creates a legal ambiguity that I'm afraid affects your ability to... The interest belongs to Connor's Land and Development, Mara said. The square went very quiet. Not entirely. There was still the distant sound of the livery and a child somewhere to the west. But the people nearby went still in a way that was its own kind of silence. Connors looked at her. His face had not changed, which told her he'd prepared for this possibility. That company held the mineral rights, she said. They acquired them from Western Territorial Holdings in 1878, a transfer that wasn't disclosed in the purchase documents drafted by the attorney representing the Garrett estate. She kept her voice even and clear, the voice she used for reading numbers back at the end of an inventory, precise and without inflection. An attorney who, I expect, will have difficulty explaining that omission if asked by a court.
Mrs. Mercer, Connor's voice was controlled, with an edge underneath it like a blade held against a table. These are complicated matters of land law. They are, she agreed, which is why we've retained counsel in Carson City to review the filings and advise us on remedies, including the question of whether the non-disclosure constitutes fraud and what that determination would mean for the person whose company held the undisclosed interest. The word fraud sat in the air of the square like a thrown stone. Someone in the loose crowd said something to the person beside them in a low voice. Briggs had gone very still. The two unofficial deputies were looking at Connors.
Connors's jaw moved slightly. He was still controlled, but the control was costing him something now, and she could see the cost in the particular tightness around his eyes. I'd be careful making accusations in a public setting, he said quietly, which was more threatening than his public voice had been. Colt stepped down from the wagon. He didn't make it dramatic. He just stepped down and stood beside Mara on the ground, which had the effect of making the geometry of the situation different. He was taller than Connors, and he used the height without theatrics, simply by existing at it. If there's been a legal wrong done to this property, Colt said, we'll find out through the proper process. That's all she's saying. He looked at Connors with the direct steadiness that was the most unsettling thing about him to people who'd expected it to crack by now. If Connor's Land and Development has a legitimate claim, it'll stand up to examination. And if it doesn't, then we'll know that too. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't performing. He said it the way he said everything, with the flatness of a man who has decided something and doesn't need the audience to validate the decision. Connors looked at him, and then at Mara, and then at the watching people around the square, and she saw him calculate and find the calculation coming out wrong. We'll settle this through the proper channels, he said. Yes, Mara said. We will. Connors turned and walked back toward his office. Briggs followed. The two deputies hesitated for a moment, and then followed too, and the crowd in the square began to move again, slowly, in the way of people who are pretending they haven't just watched something, but who will be discussing it in detail for the rest of the week. Ellen Marsh was standing at the far edge of the square near the water trough. Mara hadn't seen her when they arrived. She was standing very still with her basket in her hands, and her face had the expression of someone who has just seen the answer to a question she's been sitting with. Their eyes met across the square. Ellen gave a very small nod. One single, precise nod, the kind that means something specific rather than nothing at all. Mara looked away and climbed back onto the wagon. Her hands were steadier than they'd been after the encounter with Connors on the street 3 days ago. She noted that without surprise. Colt climbed up beside her and picked up the reins. Around them, Black Hollow resumed its afternoon with the studied normalcy of a town that had just watched something shift and was not yet sure how to account for it. They drove out of the square without speaking. Halfway up the main street, Colt said, Carson City, when? End of the week, she said. I've already written to Thomas Dodd. He wrote back yesterday. He's reviewed the documents I sent, and he wants to see the originals. Colt looked at her. You wrote to him before today. I wrote to him 4 days ago, she said, before Connors came to the square. I knew he'd come. He was quiet. I wasn't keeping it from you, she said. I was managing the sequence. I didn't want to tell you until I knew Dodd would take the case, because if he wouldn't, I needed a different plan, and I didn't want you to be waiting on something that might fall through. He sat with that for a moment. That's the thing you do, he said, where you solve for problems I don't know you're solving for. I know, she said. I'm working on saying it out loud. So am I, he said. The ranch road opened up ahead of them, and the hills to the east caught the afternoon light, and Pitch moved steadily in his traces, and the load of fencing supplies shifted slightly on the turn. There was more to come, she knew that.
Connors would not accept what had happened in the square as a final answer. Men who had controlled a situation for 11 years didn't simply accept a new arrangement because a woman had said the word fraud in front of a crowd. There would be more, and it would be harder, and she was not naive enough to think the documents alone would resolve it cleanly. But for the first time in the entire span of her life, she was not waiting for something to be done to her. She was moving toward something. She was, in the truest sense of the word, in motion. The wagon went on, and the ranch waited at the end of the road. And the north pasture, her pasture, their pasture, the one with the dry spring and the limestone ridge and the mineral rights that a dishonest man had counted on nobody examining, lay in the late sun the same shade of gold as everything else in Nevada at that hour, which was the color of something that had been there a long time and was not going anywhere. Thomas Dodd was younger than she'd expected, which Fletcher had warned her about, and which still managed to be slightly startling in person. He was maybe 24, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that youth was a liability in his profession, and was doing what he could about it with a good suit and precise hair. His office in Carson City was on the second floor of a brick building that smelled of new wood and ambition, and it was organized with a meticulousness that told her he was either very good or very anxious, and she was hoping for the former. He'd read her letter, he'd read the documents she'd sent ahead. When she and Colt came in and sat down, he didn't waste time on pleasantries beyond the minimum courtesy required. "The non-disclosure is real," he said, opening the folder on his desk. "The mineral rights reservation was in the public record. Any competent title search would have found it. Pickett either didn't look or chose not to report it, and given that the beneficiary of the undisclosed interest is the sheriff of the county where the property is located, I think we can construct a reasonable argument for the latter." "Can you prove intent?" Colt said. "Not from documents alone. Intent requires either a witness or a pattern substantial enough that a court will infer it." Thomas looked at Mara. "You mentioned in your letter that there may be additional parties. The water claim. The Sutton contract. Sutton's contract had a compensation clause that was designed to be unenforceable or punishing. I'm not sure which." Mara laid her copy on his desk. "I'd like your opinion on whether the language suggests someone with legal training helped draft it." He read it. His expression shifted twice while he read, the small calibrations of someone finding what they expected to find. "This clause here," he said, tapping the page, "the rate calculation provision. This is not how a rancher writes a contract. The syntax is deliberate. Someone knew what they were doing." He looked up. "If Pickett drafted this as well, or anyone connected to him, that's a pattern. How do we establish that?" "We ask," he said, "not Pickett directly. But contracts like this get witnessed, notarized. There's a notary stamp on the third page here from this county. I can pull the notary records and find out who commissioned this document." He set it down. "It'll take 2 weeks." "We don't have 2 weeks," Mara said. "Connors knows we're looking. He's going to move." Thomas looked at her steadily. "Move how? I don't know yet, but he's controlled this county for 11 years, and he's not going to wait for us to build a clean case if he can complicate it first." She thought about his face in the square, the calculation, the controlled adjustment. He has freight contracts. He has relationships with the county commissioners. He has ways of making things difficult that don't require him to do anything illegal. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was not, she realized, a man who rushed to appear decisive. He thought and then he spoke, which was the right order. "Then we file first," he said. "We file what we have today, the title discrepancy, the non-disclosure, the apparent conflict of interest. We don't wait to have the Sutton connection. We file the case that exists, and we add to it as we build it." "Is what we have enough to hold up?" Colt said. "It's enough to open a proceeding," Thomas said, "which is different from enough to win. But opening a proceeding creates a record, and a record is harder to interfere with than a private investigation." He closed the folder. "It also tells Connors that the window for quiet resolution has closed." Colt looked at Mara. She looked back at him. "File it," she said. But the filing went in on a Friday. By Tuesday of the following week, Black Hollow knew about it, which was faster than she'd expected and which told her that the courthouse in Carson City was not as insulated from local networks as she'd hoped. She found out it was known when she went to the dry goods store to pick up an order and found 3 women she barely knew standing near the counter who went slightly quiet when she walked in, with the specific quality of quiet that meant her name had been in the conversation immediately before her arrival.
She bought what she'd come for and left without addressing it.
But she thought about it on the ride back. The story that was circulating in Black Hollow was, she suspected, not identical to the facts. Stories never were. They traveled through a town the way water traveled through rock, finding the paths of least resistance, reshaping slightly with each passage, arriving at their destination recognizable but altered. What people in Black Hollow would be hearing was probably some version of Mara Ellison, Mercer now.
Though some of them would still be using the old name, she was sure of it, had filed some kind of legal action against the sheriff. That was true, as far as it went. It just wasn't the whole shape of it. What happened next was that Connors made his move, and it was not the move she'd anticipated, which was useful information about him. It meant he was more reactive than strategic when cornered, which in turn meant the filing had worked faster than Thomas had predicted. He came to the ranch. Not Briggs this time. Not a messenger. He came himself, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was overcast and the light was flat and gray, in the way that made the Nevada landscape look like something painted rather than real. She saw him coming down the ranch road from the kitchen window, and she went to find Colt, who was in the barn. "Connors," she said. Colt set down what he was doing. "Alone?" "Alone." They went out together and stood on the porch. Connors dismounted and approached with the careful deliberateness of a man who has thought about this encounter and is performing his version of calm. "Mercer," he said, "I'd like to speak with you privately." "There's no privately here," Colt said. Connor's jaw shifted. "What I have to say might be better." "Then say it here," Mara said. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen on his face before, which was a kind of tiredness underneath the performance. Not regret exactly, but something adjacent to the recognition of a situation that had become more complicated than intended. She'd seen that look before, on Fletcher Dodd, when she'd confronted him about her wages, on Sutton, when the county surveyor had showed up with his instruments. It was the look of a man whose working assumption about a person had been wrong, and who was now having to revise while the situation kept moving. "I'd like to discuss a resolution," he said, "without the courts involved." "What kind of resolution?" Colt said. "The mineral rights interest can be transferred," Connors said. Connors' land and development would relinquish the claim, in exchange for the withdrawal of the filing. The morning air was still. Somewhere in the north pasture, one of the cattle moved and settled. "And Pickett," Mara said. Connors looked at her. "You're offering to give up the mineral rights claim," she said. "You're not offering anything about how the non-disclosure happened or who was responsible. You're not offering anything about the Sutton contract. The Sutton matter is separate." "It isn't," she said. "We have the notary records from Carson City. The notary who stamped the Sutton contract is the same notary Pickett's office uses for all their county work. We have that connection." "Basas. Parseis." She watched his face. "We also have a statement from Vance Cates." This last part was not entirely true. Thomas had located Cates in Elko and written to him, and Cates had written back with a letter that was careful but confirmatory of the meeting Mara had heard about from Ellen, and whether that letter constituted a statement in the legal sense that Thomas intended to use was still a question. But it was true enough that Connors didn't know how true it was. The tiredness in his face went deeper. "What do you want?" he said. And this version of the question was different from any earlier version. It was a real question, not a tactical one. The kind a person asks when they've stopped performing and are actually trying to understand the terms. "I want the mineral rights transferred," she said. "In writing, witnessed, filed with the county recorder. I want an amended disclosure filed acknowledging the original omission, which will make the Pickett matter a civil question for the estate's legal representation to sort out. And I want your resignation from the board of the County Freight Commission." Connor stared at her. "The freight contracts are how you've been managing this county," she said. "Not just us. I've spoken to 3 other ranchers in the past 2 weeks who've had unexplained problems with their contract renewals. I'm not asking you to resign as sheriff, though I suspect that may become a separate conversation once the full record is reviewed. I'm asking you to remove yourself from the commission, which is where the practical leverage lives." Colt had gone very still beside her. She'd told him most of this. Not all of it, because some of it she'd worked out in the past 48 hours and hadn't had the chance to say yet. She was aware of that, and she would explain it later. He would be frustrated, briefly, And then he would understand, and they would have the conversation about it that people who are actually trying to be honest with each other have.
Connors was quiet for a long time. A long time for a man standing on someone else's porch being told what the terms were. "The other ranchers," he said, "have they filed?" "Not yet," she said. "Whether they do depends on how this conversation goes." She didn't know if that was entirely true. Two of the three ranchers had been cautious. They had grievances, but they also had freight contracts they were afraid of losing, and fear was a powerful adhesive. The third, a woman named Dolores Prentice, who ran a horse operation east of town and who had the manner of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for about 4 years, had been more forthcoming. Dolores was the real leverage. Connors probably knew about Dolores. "Give me a week," Connors said. "You have 3 days," Mara said. "Thomas Dodd will receive a written commitment by Friday, or we proceed with the full case and add the freight commission connection to the filing." He looked at her one more time. It was a thorough look, the kind that tries to find something to use, some crack in the position. She held it without expression. He turned and mounted his horse and rode back down the ranch road. Colt waited until he was out of earshot. "Cates gave a statement." "He gave a letter," she said. "It's not quite the same thing." "I'm hoping Connors doesn't know the difference." A beat of quiet. "The freight commission," Colt said. "You didn't tell me that part." "I worked it out 2 days ago. I was going to tell you tonight." She looked at him. "I know. You could have said it this morning." "I could have. I was still deciding whether it was the right demand or whether it would push him too far." She turned to face him fully. "I'm still learning where the line is, between handling something and handling it alone." He was quiet for a moment that was not comfortable but was honest. "I know you are," he said. I'm not angry. I just want to be in it." "You were in it," she said. "You standing there was half of what just happened." "That's not the same." "No," she said. "It's not." She put her hand on the porch rail, the one they'd replaced with rope, and that was still rope because they hadn't gotten to it yet. "I'll tell you first next time, even when I'm not sure." "That's what I'm asking for," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking you for it too." Tabam. The written commitment arrived on Thursday. Thomas sent word from Carson City the same day. Connor's own attorney had contacted him and agreed to the terms, with minor language adjustments that Thomas said were cosmetic. The mineral rights transfer was executed the following week, filed and recorded. A clean and public document with Connors' signature at the bottom and a notary stamp from a different notary than Pickett used, which was Thomas's particular quiet emphasis on the point. Connors resigned from the Freight Commission on a Friday, which was listed in the County Gazette the following week in a brief notice that cited personal reasons without elaborating. Mara read it at the kitchen table over coffee and folded the paper and set it down. She thought about what she expected to feel, and she found that what she actually felt was different. Not triumph, which was too clean, but something more worn and specific, like the feeling after a very long day of physical work when you sit down and realize you've done what you set out to do and your body is the evidence of it. Tired, certain, present. "Is it done?" Colt said from across the table. "The legal part," she said. "The Pickett matter is still a civil question that the Garrett estate has to answer, and Connors is still sheriff, so there's still—" She stopped. "But the ranch is clear," he said. "The ranch is clear," she said. He nodded once and drank his coffee. The dance was not her idea. It was Dolores Prentice's idea, which perhaps should have been predictable given that Dolores had the energy of a person who had been holding back a great deal of action for a long time and was now expressing it in multiple directions at once. She showed up at the ranch on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after the commitment was signed, with the announcement that the town was holding a community gathering in the square the following Saturday, and that she had, on behalf of several people whose names she listed with the comprehensive authority of a woman who manages a list, arranged for a fiddle player and food, and the use of the square platform. "It's not a celebration of the legal thing," Dolores said, sitting at Mara's kitchen table with coffee she'd poured herself. She was 51, with gray in her dark hair and boots that were better maintained than most men's saddles. "It's a gathering, but people know what it means." "Some people will be uncomfortable," Mara said. "Some people are always uncomfortable. That's their work, not yours.
Dolores looked at her with the directness of a woman who had decided Mara Ellison was worth her time, which was not a decision she made about many people. You should be there. Both of you. Not hiding out here like you've done something to be ashamed of. I haven't been hiding.
You've been working, Dolores said, which is different from hiding but looks similar from the outside. Come to the gathering. She stood and put her cup in the basin with the efficiency of someone who has said what she came to say. Wear something that isn't work clothes. She left. Mara looked at the door she'd gone out of. She's not wrong, Colt said, from where he'd been leaning against the wall during this entire exchange with the expression of a man who had understood about 3 sentences and that this was not a conversation he was a principal in. I know, Mara said. She went upstairs and opened the cedar chest. The burgundy dress had been worn exactly once, at the wedding, which had been 11 minutes and a judge and a deputy and no guests. She shook it out and hung it in the room that was now properly her room, cleared of the crates and furnished with a proper bed and a chest of drawers that she'd found in a second-hand lot in town and refinished herself over 4 evenings because the original finish had been damaged. The dress needed a small repair at the left cuff, which she did herself. And when she put it on Saturday evening and looked at herself in the small square mirror above the washstand, she thought about what she saw without the usual editorial that her mind ran automatically. The familiar list of things that were wrong or insufficient. She looked at herself and saw a woman in a good dress who was going somewhere. That was the whole assessment. It felt, unremarkably, like enough. Colt was at the bottom of the stairs when she came down. He was wearing his better coat, the one he kept for town, and he'd made an effort with his hair that hadn't entirely succeeded, but that she found she didn't mind about. He looked at her and said, "You look," and then stopped, which was either because he couldn't find the right word or because he decided the right word was too much. "So do you," she said, saving them both. They rode in together as the light was going amber and long across the road, and the hills were the color they went in early October when the summer heat had finally conceded, and something newer and cooler had moved in at the edges of the days. She thought about the first time she'd ridden this road, going the other direction, with her 2 bags and the specific hollowness of a person who has decided something but not yet found out whether the decision was sound. The square was lit. Someone had strung lanterns between the posts at the corners, and the light they made was warm and unsteady in the slight wind. And there were people, more than she'd expected, though she should have expected it, because Dolores was a person who had never in her life organized something small. The fiddle player was already going, a loose, unhurried tune, and there were children running in the edges of the light, the way children run when there's something happening that they don't fully understand but that suggests freedom. She felt the familiar pull. The instinct to find the edge of the gathering, the peripheral position, the place where she could be present without being visible. She knew the pull. She recognized it. She let it exist and then she set it down, the way you set down something heavy when you've arrived where you were going. Colt tied the horse and came to stand beside her. He looked at the square, then at her. "Ready?" "Almost," she said. She thought about the stage. It was still there. They used it for auctions and public notices, and it had not been dismantled since the bride selection, because stages don't get dismantled just because something bad happened on them. It was just boards and timber. She'd known that intellectually. Standing in front of it now, with the lantern light catching the worn grain of the wood, she found that she knew it differently, in the way you know a thing when it no longer has power over you, which is quieter and more specific than the way you know it when it does. She walked into the square. She walked in not slowly and not performing anything, just walking at the pace she walked, which was the pace of someone who had covered significant ground on foot and on horseback and had stopped thinking about how she looked while doing it. People saw her. She was aware of being seen. She held it the way she'd learned to hold pitch's speed, not by tensing against it, but by staying present in it, balanced, committed to the next moment, and the one after that. Ellen Marsh was near the food table. She caught Mara's eye and nodded, the same single nod from across the square, but closer this time and with something additional in it that might have been satisfaction or might have been relief, or both. Clara Higgins was there with the young man who'd raised his hand so fast at the selection. She looked at Mara as she passed and her expression was complicated, something between recognition
and the beginning of something she hadn't quite worked out yet. Mara nodded at her and kept walking. Patricia, the rancher's wife who'd stood beside her before her name was called, who had looked at her and then at the stage and then back, calculating the distance, was standing near the lantern post talking to another woman. When Mara passed, she said, "Mrs. Mercer," with the quiet courtesy of someone who has revised their accounting. "Patricia," Mara said. She found Dolores near the fiddle player, talking to two men Mara didn't know with the energy of someone mid-point in a conversation they're winning. Dolores broke off when she saw them and came over with the expression of a woman whose satisfaction was too well-founded to bother concealing. "You came," she said. "You told me to," Mara said. "I tell a lot of people to do things. Most of them don't." Dolores looked at Colt. "Mercer, good." "Prentice," he said. "Come get food," she said, and turned and went toward the table with the expectation that they would follow, which they did. The fiddle player shifted to a dance tune around the time the stars were fully out, and people began to move in the space between the stage and the food tables with the informal arrangement of frontier dancing. Not formal, not organized, just people responding to music in the particular way that humans respond to music when they're tired and have eaten and the lanterns are warm. She was standing at the edge of it, watching, when Colt came to stand beside her. He'd been talking to a rancher from the South District who'd come over specifically to find him, which she'd observed from a distance, and which told her that word of the legal proceedings had traveled further than just Black Hollow. "You want to dance?" he said. Not as a question exactly, as an offering. She looked at the people moving in the lantern light, and she thought about the first thing people in this town had known about her. That she was the woman everyone had laughed at when her name was called to stand on the stage. That was still the first thing, for most of them. It would be the first thing for a while. You didn't rewrite a town's understanding of you in 2 months, but you could add to it. You could give it something additional to hold alongside the first thing, and over time the weight shifted, and the first thing didn't change, but it became less of the total. "Yes," she said. It was not a revelation. She was not a natural dancer. She'd known that before, and it remained true, and the first 2 steps confirmed it, and she compensated and found a working version of the rhythm that was functional rather than graceful. Colt danced with the particular competence of someone who has learned a thing by necessity rather than by inclination, which meant they were evenly matched in the specific way of 2 people who are not pretending. She was aware of being watched. She'd been aware of being watched her whole life. The difference was in what the watching felt like now, not the passive experience of being the subject of other people's assessment, but something more mutual. She was in the square. The square was in her. Neither held all the meaning anymore. The fiddle went on and they stayed in it. She found about halfway through the second song that she wasn't thinking about who was watching anymore. She was just there, in the lantern light, with the music, with the smell of the October night coming in off the high desert, with the man who had stood beside her in front of Connors and said the word we like. It was the simplest thing. She thought about this day on the stage, and then she thought about Pitch running in the north pasture. And she thought about the pump behind the barn and the rust on her hands, and about the survey documents and the notary stamp and the letter from Kate's, and about her grandmother's dress, and about what her mother had said standing in the doorway. I didn't mean for it to be so hard. And she thought about all the years she'd spent taking up as little space as possible. And she thought, well, here is some space. Here is what I'm doing with it. The song ended. Another began. They kept dancing. Awesome. Later, walking back toward the hitching post through the edge of the square, she passed the stage. She stopped in front of it. Colt stopped beside her. She looked at it for a moment. The worn boards, the 3 steps, the familiar geometry of the thing. The lanterns were far enough away that it sat mostly in shadow. "I used to think about it," she said, "whether it would always feel like that, like the worst place I'd ever stood." "Does it now?" She considered. "It feels like a stage," she said. "Boards and timber, that's all?" He was quiet. "It matters," she said. "Not because I need it to not bother me anymore, but because the distance between what it was and what it is now, that distance is something I made." She looked at it a moment longer. "I made that." "You did," he said. "We did," she corrected herself. "But I was part of it. That's different from before when things just happened to me. They stood there a minute, which was not dramatic and not long, just the time it takes to properly register a thing before you move on from it. Then she turned away from the stage and they walked to the horse. The ride home was easy in the way that things are easy when you've done the hard version and your body knows the difference. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over Nevada were the Nevada stars, which were more than stars should reasonably be. Too many, too bright. The whole sky overfull with them, the way the landscape was overfull with itself in the daytime. She thought, riding, about the things she'd learned that she hadn't known when this started. She'd learned that strength is not the same as not needing anything. That had been her working definition for most of her life, and it had kept her functional, and had kept her alone in a way that she'd thought was just her nature, but was actually a choice she'd been making without knowing she was making it. Real strength, the kind that was useful, the kind you could actually do something with, included the ability to say, I can't read this contract and I need help. Or, the pump is broken and I've been managing it alone and I shouldn't have. Or, tell me what's wrong with this ranch, all of it, and trust that I won't use the knowledge against you. She'd learned that people who have been treated as unimportant for long enough start to treat themselves that way. Not because they believe it exactly, but because it becomes the most available framework. And that the only way out of that framework was not someone telling you that you were wrong about yourself, though that helped when the person saying it was someone whose assessment you'd learned to respect, but doing something that the framework said you couldn't do, and then doing it again, and then again, until the framework didn't fit anymore, and you had to find a different one. She'd learned that Colt Mercer was a difficult man in ways that were not visible from the outside, that he held things closely and released them slowly, and that this was not coldness, but its opposite, a form of investment so serious that he didn't know how to be casual about it, that he had made mistakes with his brother that he hadn't repaired, and that those mistakes informed the way he was trying to be now, with her, with the same material that had failed in a different set of hands, that people were almost always trying to fix the last thing, and that the trick was to know which part of that was useful and which part needed setting down. She'd learned that Black Hollow was not her enemy. It was a town, made of people, and people were generally doing their best with what they had, and what they had was limited and shaped by what they'd been given. And some of them, the Ellens and the Doloreses and the Patricias with their quiet later courtesies, were capable of more than the structure they'd been handed if something came along to give them a reason to reach for it. She hadn't changed Black Hollow. She had no illusion about that. Connors was still the sheriff, and Briggs still ran his freight operation, and there were still women who would stand in that square and wait to be chosen or not chosen, and the structure of that would not change because one woman had read some land documents and danced in the square. Change didn't work that way. It worked slowly, in aggregate, accumulating the way water accumulated in a dry spring, invisible for a long time, and then suddenly, one day, present. But she had added something to the total. She was sure of that. They reached the ranch road and turned down it, and the house appeared at the end of it as it always did now, low and solid and lit by one lamp in the window that Colt had left burning before they left, which was a habit of his that she'd noticed and not mentioned because she wasn't sure he knew he did it. Some things you didn't need to name to appreciate. She put Pitch in the barn. He accepted the unsaddling with the comfortable tolerance of an animal that has made his decision about a person and settled into it, and went into the house. Colt came in behind her and they moved through the familiar choreography of the end of an evening, the lamps and the water and the ordinary small tasks. And it was not romantic and it was not peaceful in any performed sense, but it was theirs, entirely. Built from nothing by two people who had been handed different versions of the same problem and had found, improbably, that the problems fit together. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots and set them beside the chest of drawers she'd refinished. She thought about the cedar chest at her mother's house, now empty. She'd taken the dress. She'd left the chest. Her mother had sent word last week, a brief note, written in the small, careful handwriting of a woman who did not write often, that she'd put some of Ruth's own things in the chest. Quilts, the note said, things that should stay in the family. It was a small thing. It was enough of a thing. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought, I am 26 years old, and I am in a room I've made my own, and tomorrow I will get up and do work that matters, and the day after that, the same. That is not everything. But it is not nothing. It is so far from nothing that the word nothing doesn't even belong in the same sentence. The lamp was still lit. She could hear the night outside the window. That particular Nevada night sound that was between nothing and breathing, the high desert just existing at it always had and would. She thought about the spring in the north pasture that Thomas said might start running again. The water table was higher than it had appeared in the survey he'd mentioned in his last letter, which had also contained the news that the picket matter was proceeding through civil channels without requiring her further involvement. She thought about the limestone ridge and what might be under it and whether it mattered, and she decided that it mattered the way all things mattered, as a problem that would arrive in its own time and would be handled when it did. She thought about Colt's brother, somewhere in Montana with an unanswered letter in a drawer, or already lost. She thought about what it would mean for Colt if an answer came, and what it would mean if one didn't, and she thought, that is his thing to carry. I can be beside him while he carries it. That is not the same as carrying it for him, and it is better. She closed her eyes. Outside, one of the horses moved in the barn, the muffled sound of it coming through the wall as a comfortable weight, like proof that the world was still in place. Somewhere in the process of listening to it, she slept. The letter from Montana arrived 3 weeks later. It was on the kitchen table when she came in from the morning feeding, leaning against the coffee cup she'd left out, which meant Colt had come in before her and found it and left it there rather than opening it alone. She looked at it. His brother's handwriting on the front. She didn't know the handwriting, but she knew it had to be his because there was no one else in Montana who would write to Colt Mercer with that kind of urgency visible in the pressed hard pen strokes. She got 2 cups and poured the coffee and brought it to the table and sat down. Colt came in from the barn a few minutes later. He stopped when he saw her at the table with the coffee, 2 cups, and the letter sitting between them. He sat down. He looked at the letter for a moment without touching it. "You don't have to open it with me here," she said. "I know," he said. He reached out and picked it up. His hands, she noticed, were entirely steady, the way they always were. He opened it. She looked at her coffee and gave him the privacy of not watching his face while he read. She listened to the morning outside the window and thought about the fence line and the water trough levels and the order she'd been meaning to put into the feed store, the ordinary material of ordinary days. He set the letter down. She looked up. His face had done something, not dramatic. He was not a man who did things dramatically, but something had shifted in it, the same slight release she'd seen by lamplight on that first early morning with the Sutton contract, the held tension giving way. "He's coming in the spring," Colt said. She looked at him. "He says—" Colt stopped, cleared his throat, which was the closest thing to being moved that she'd seen him do. "He says he should have written back sooner. He says he knows." He set the letter down flat on the table. "He's got a wife now, apparently. They're coming together." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Good," she said. "Yeah," he said. They sat there with that, the 2 of them at the kitchen table in the morning light with the coffee and the letter, and the particular weight of a good thing that has arrived after a long time. It was not neat. There would be things to work out between Colt and his brother that a letter and a winter's distance hadn't resolved, and that would have to be lived through in real time. She knew that, and she thought Colt did too. Nothing was going to be neat, but it was real. It was the realest kind of thing there was. People trying to find their way back to each other across a distance they'd made themselves, because the alternative was the distance becoming permanent. She thought, this is what courage actually is. Not the absence of fear, not the big confrontation in the square, not the filing or the dance or the confrontation on the porch. It is this, the letter written, the letter answered, the small sustained willingness to stay present for the next thing and the one after that, in the specific unremarkable reality of a life being built rather than endured. She'd spent most of her life not knowing she had access to that, not knowing it was hers to decide. She knew it now. Outside, the Nevada morning was doing what Nevada mornings did, burning off the night cold with a slow, specific light that started at the edge of the hills and moved across the land in the methodical way of something that has been doing this for a very long time and has not once failed to arrive. The horses were awake in the barn. The north pasture was still, the dry spring sitting beneath the frost-edged grass, waiting for the table to rise. Mara Ellison, Mercer now,
fully now, in every sense that mattered, drank her coffee, and let the morning come in.